So as mentioned before, the kind of guiding principle or the main message of symbolic interactionism is that meaning matters. And it can be tempting to dismiss the role and importance and power of meaning because meaning just seems like a definition or interpretation. It seems like just words. And, sticks and stones will break my bones, but, names will never hurt me. Just mere labels would never hurt me. But that perspective really overlooks just how powerful and influential meaning can be. And for me, the best expression for why meaning is so powerful is the Thomas theorem, which Thomas defines as if people, define situations as real, they are real in their consequence. So it doesn't really matter whether something is really, ultimately, fundamentally true, capital T true, but if people believe something is real, then for all intents and purposes it is real, and in many cases it can have real consequences that can result from it. All right. So I think we've talked about this before in this class, but over in India, cows are seen as sacred and divine beings. And personally, I don't happen to think that cows are divine beings. So I have a different understanding of cows than people over in India do. But in India, they believe this, and there are real consequences if people go against this belief. So if you were to go over to India and say, start looking at and picking out cows and saying like, oh, these would be great to eat, for Hindu people, that could be very disgraceful and very sacrilegious act. And there could be real consequences that result from that. And the people could be very offended, or they might take issue with what you say and either verbally chastise you or potentially worse, because that's such an affront to their belief system. Many of you are familiar with the Stanford prison experiment, where in the 1960s, people basically played prison in the bottom of the psychology building at Stanford. And within a day or two, even though they were in fake prison, the prisoners felt as if they were in real prison and had real consequences as a result of this. Like people thought they couldn't get out of fake prison and had real psychological breakdowns because they thought they were in prison. And people started showing and displaying behaviors similar to those of people who are new to real prisons. Even situations of like pranks and jokes, right? Uh, in the time in which someone is being fooled, even though they're being fooled, so ultimately what they're being told isn't true, while they believe it's true, it can have real consequences. It's hard to track down now. I'll see if I can find it somewhere. But you may know the show Punk'd, where Ashton Kutcher would prank various celebrities. My favorite one was at one point he punked Justin Timberlake, and Ashton Kutcher made up a fake government agency, told Justin Timberlake that he had unpaid taxes, and this enforcement agency of the government, which doesn't exist, was there to seize all of his property. And during this punked episode, Justin Timberlake showed real distress. Like he was really freaking out because he thought all his property was being taken away. And then obviously, once he figured out that it was being punked, then, he kind of went back to being his normal self. But even though this wasn't a real situation, while he was being punked, he defined it as real, and there were real consequences as a result. So meaning can be quite powerful, even if we underappreciate that or have a tendency to underappreciate that. All right. One final thing we want to look at is Mead's conception of self. And the main point here is that for Mead, the self is fundamentally social. And to get at this, Mead starts talking about the idea that the self is reflexive, in that it can be both the subject and object of thought. In other words, we can think, so we're the subject of thoughts because we're the ones doing the thinking, but we can think about ourselves, and therefore we're the object of thought. So we are thinking about ourselves, both subject and object. So we're self-conscious. Then the question that Mead poses is, how is it possible to think about yourself? Right? How can you be both subject and object? Where does the ability to objectify yourself come from? And Mead's answer is that we do this by taking the role of the other. Essentially, we use other people as a vantage point from which to see ourselves. So we imagine how other people see us. And then we use our imagination of how other people see us as a way in order to understand and be able to see ourselves. So we kind of use others as mirrors in which we can reflect back our thoughts and understandings of ourselves. So if I'm trying to think, am I a good person? Really what that means is, do I think other people think I'm a good person? Or would other people view what I do as a good person? Or if I'm wondering if I did a good job on something, I'm probably not evaluating that based on my own personal thoughts and values, but I'm thinking about how other people would view my actions. And if I perceive that they would view them favorably, then I can think like, oh, all right, maybe, I did do a good job. But if I start to think that other people wouldn't view my actions in a positive light, then maybe I think I did a bad job or I didn't do something as well as I could have. So our ability to think of ourselves is anchored from the perspective of others and how we imagine they view us. So again, self-consciousness equals our ability of being conscious of how we imagine others see us. And so the self is fundamentally social in nature. And again, this is kind of like this is a somewhat paradoxical conclusion, but Mead's argument is, in order to really develop our self as kind of an individual being, it's actually a very social process. So to be an individual, uh, our individuality stems from a very sociological process and the sociological development of ourself. Now, from Mead's point of view, there are certain entities and beings that are not self-conscious in the sense that they don't have the ability to think about how others view them. And because they don't have that ability to think about how others view them, they have no ways of assessing or valuing themselves. So one example of this, and we'll talk more about this here in a minute, are very young children, right? When kids are really young, they just don't have the mental facilities and faculties to be able to imagine how other people see them. And so because of that, they don't have a self-consciousness. And what that means then is you can put little kids in really ridiculous outfits and they don't have any understanding of it. They don't understand that they look ridiculous, right? Or they look really cute, or they're so ridiculous that it becomes cute, right? They don't have that ability, and they can't make sense of this kind of situation. Similarly, dogs also do not have this ability to think about how others view them, and so they can't be self-conscious in the way that Mead thinks about it. And so because of that, we can do things like this to poodles and make them look really ridiculous. And they don't understand that they look ridiculous. Now, if we see our dog after getting a haircut and they look like this, right, we might laugh, we might react towards them differently. And our reactions to them could cause them to change their behavior. But they would not be able to understand that our reactions are based on how they look, and therefore they could start thinking about themselves in terms of, oh, I look ridiculous, therefore I'm embarrassed or ashamed. They just don't have that process in the same way that fully capable adults do and humans do. Now, Mead wants to argue and there's a fair amount of empirical support behind this, that we develop ourselves, we become human, or quintessentially human in the sense of we become self-conscious. We do it through social interaction, but it takes place through a number of different stages of development. So the first stage is the play stage, and this happens in really young adolescence. And this is where kids develop the ability to think or to see themselves from the perspective of one other person. So uh, this is their initial ability to think of themselves through the eyes of others. So they're making a big sense in sense of developing their self-concept and self-consciousness, but they can only do it from one other concrete person's perspective. So when kids start to play teacher and student, they're only playing two roles here. And they're able now to, if this child, say, adopts the perspective of the teacher, they can now, from this vantage point, understand how they, as a student in normal life, are viewed by this one other person. So this is social thinking, but it's social thinking that's only limited to one other person, one other role at a time. Uh, and my son very much engaged in the play stage and for a long period of time. And anytime he had any sort of novel interaction, we would come home and play it. And part of what he was doing was he was figuring out how other people view him in particular situations. So if we'd go to the doctor, we'd come home, and as soon as we got home from the doctor, he'd want to play doctor, in which he was the doctor and then I was the patient. And by playing this way, what he was doing is he was understanding his own experience of being a patient by playing the role of doctor, and then doing certain things to understand how that would interact with a patient, where I was playing the role of him as a patient. Or if we go out to dinner, we'd come home and he'd play waiter, and it was the same thing. Any sort of interaction we had like that, uh, he would recreate it, and by recreating it, he was getting a sense of himself. But his sense of himself was fundamentally a social process because he's adopting the perspective of another person. Over time, Mead says that, or argues that kids move into the game stage. And this is where they're able to adopt the perspective of multiple other people simultaneously. So the play stage is just one person. In the game stage, it's multiple other people simultaneously. An example of this can be seen in the type of games that kids play, and how you can't really have team sports for really young kids because they just have no conception of how to operate as a team. They can only think in very basic terms and can usually adopt the perspective of a limited number of perspectives, probably just one. So when my son was young, like 5 or 6, right, we did the typical thing where we signed him up to play soccer. And uh, I said I was willing to help coach. And so we went to the coaching clinic, and they said for kids this age, the one thing and the only thing that you're responsible for teaching kids at this age is which direction they're supposed to go. So which goal are they supposed to kick the ball at? Because that's all they're capable of. They can't understand teamwork, right? They don't really understand the difference between offense and defense. All the kids do is they run after the ball and wherever it is. And if it's on the left side of the field, all the kids are on the left side of the field. If it's on the right side of the field, they all run that direction, right? And your only goal is, again, as a coach, is to let them know that they're supposed to kick at this end as opposed to the other end, right? You go after this goal and not this goal, because they're basically still stuck in the play stage. They can't think as a team. Now, at some point, kids can start adopting the perspective of other people, multiple other people simultaneously, and this is where you can start playing team sports. So Mead uses the example of baseball, and the point is, we know in baseball, people have different positions, and each position has a different responsibility. And you should know that if a particular player does one thing, you might have to do something else, or might have to do something based on that first person's reaction or their decision. Uh, I use hockey just because I know that better. And in hockey, I generally play defense, right? So my primary goal is to try to prevent the other team from scoring. But there are times if I'm handling the puck, maybe there is a chance where I can get an offensive opportunity. And normally on defense, you play back in the offensive zone, like when you're attacking. So you're normally, because you're the last line of defense, so normally you're the player closest to your own goalie. But if I have the puck and have a chance to score, I might advance and come close to their other goalie. And again, if you're operating as a team, if an offensive player sees me jump down into an offensive role playing defense, they should know that they should go from playing offense and go back to defensive position. So we have someone playing defense back there, and at some point we'll switch our roles back. All right. The particular for any sport doesn't matter, but the main thing is you understand how you coordinate multiple others simultaneously, multiple roles going on. And so you can see this as kids get older, you can play more elaborate games and you can have people taking on different roles because they can understand how to view themselves and their actions from the light of multiple other people. And then Mead argues that the final stage of this kind of self development is the generalized other. And Mead argues that our full sense of the self only emerges when we get here. And what the generalized other is that we can understand our actions from the perspective of the community as a whole. So I'm not just thinking about understanding my actions based on this one other person or the 6 or 7 other people, as it would be in the game stage, but I understand how the community as a whole would understand the actions that I'm taking. So, in the case of Gettysburg, right, I realized if I was to do certain things, that the community as a whole would have a certain action or reaction based on what I'm doing. Right, let's say I win some award, right, that's pretty prestigious. I know that that would be received well by the Gettysburg community as a whole. I also understand that if I did something really stupid, right, or really bad, or I engaged in sort of misconduct, I would understand that the community as a whole would look very disfavorably upon it. So this development of the self goes from is just increasingly abstract. The first kind of like the first stage emerges when we can finally see ourselves from outside of ourselves. So the play stage is like the first stage in which we're thinking socially about ourselves, but it's from one other person. Then we move into a small number of people, and then we move into the community as a whole. And for Mead, once we can think of our perspectives from the community as a whole, then we have a true sense of self, or the self that is fully developed. All right, that's it for symbolic interactionism. And in class, we'll talk about Goffman. We'll see aspects of symbolic interaction as thought in Goffman, but then we'll also see in which the ways that Goffman takes these ideas and introduces other ones that are pretty unique to him.